So by now I know you're asking yourself, is academic debate really just a bunch of people screaming at each other? When we get into arguments, it's usually because we have an overwhelming desire to tell everybody else that they're horribly wrong and you're right. Well, academic debate really isn't about that. Academic debate is about having a hearty discussion where we actually try to learn something. Imagine. There are three real steps to entering a debate, and we'll talk more about what you do once you get there. But first, the three steps of entering a debate. First, your claim has to be about something over which there can be reasonable differences. What I mean by this is that you can't say something that's just so obvious nobody can possibly argue and expect to be a part of a debate. I'm going to start an argument with you. It rains when there's clouds in the sky. Oh, well, of course it does. I'm going to make another argument with you. Trump is our current president. Well, yeah. It's like saying the sun is hot. There's not really a reasonable difference to be made here. Now, if we talked about the effectiveness of Trump's presidency, we could have a variety of viewpoints, and it's that variety of viewpoints that's important. Simple answers tend to be boring as all get out, but complex answers, or areas where there is more than one possible answer, those are where we really want to be. For example, what caused World War II? What event caused America to enter World War II? Easy, huh? It's going to be Pearl Harbor. No, not that Pearl Harbor. This Pearl Harbor. Before Pearl Harbor, we were not in World War II. After Pearl Harbor, we were. There's a pretty simple straight line to be drawn here, and I couldn't really argue successfully that there was any other single event that precipitated us going into World War II. There were a bunch of other things that could have sent us into World War II, but this was the one that actually happened. So, as an argument goes, it's kind of a non-starter, because there's no way to disagree with it. If we talk about World War I, though, what caused World War I? It's a bit harder of a question, because it's not nearly as definitive. Well, the answer that you've probably been taught somewhere in school it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Which is all well and good, but an archduke gets knocked off. Is that really going to be enough to set the world into a giant war? It's not a great explanation. It's an event that happened and then the war happened, but it doesn't really explain why everything broke down. So, the average high school teacher would next say, well, it had something to do with the amount of treaties that were signed and the protection pacts. I went to you and said, hey, I think Joe over there is going to attack us. If he does, I'll come to your aid if you come to mine. And you're like, okay. And then Joe hears this and goes, hey, Susie, I think those two are planning something. If one of them attacks us, will you back me up? And so on and so forth. And you just keep doing this and doing this. And there is a certain truth to that was how Europe was before World War I. Lots of countries had lots of pacts with lots of other pacts. And yeah, when something happened that would set off a war, it pretty much guaranteed that everybody was going to be sucked into it. And it was that complex. I found the most complex Venn diagram in the world about it. Well, there are more complex Venn diagrams, but this is still pretty in-depth. It shows you the massive level of treaties that jumped back and forth. But you know what? This still doesn't really explain anything at all. Because it doesn't explain why these countries felt the need to have such massive treaties. So we need to examine why they felt they had the need for such massive treaties. And the answers can be very complex. You can boil it down to imperialism, to militarism, to nationalism. There were a few other isms you could probably put in there, but those are the three most common ones. And each of them has their own merit for being a driving force. I mean, in terms of imperialism, Germany was growing quite heavily and quite quickly. They hadn't been around as a country all that long at this point in time. They were a bunch of principalities before, and they had been in loose alliances before, but as a country, they weren't all that old, which meant that they weren't as involved in imperialism as a lot of the other countries were. And imperialism was a big deal at this time. The chart on the left shows Africa. Ethiopia seems to not be directly connected to anyone else, but that's about all you can say for it. Look at the just sheer volume of land that France had. And then France is in the blue. And then you want to compare that to the small amount of land that Germany had. They had Southwest Africa, they had Togoland, Cameroon, East Africa, but still, in terms of general size, they're getting dwarfed by the British and the French. And when you go over to Asia, particularly to Southeastern Asia, you can again see Britain is well represented. The Dutch are well represented. The French have Vietnam. They did about as well as we did with Vietnam. The Japanese had places. Germany, they had a little bit of New Guinea. And as an up-and-coming country, Germany wanted more land. Okay, that's one possible thing that's going on. There are others. Nationalism was a big case. This is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you look at all the various nationalities, ethnicities that were jumbled up inside. Does this look like it's going to be a particularly stable place? There was also a desire to unite the Slavic people throughout Europe, yes, and that played into it. There was mass conflict between the British and the Germans, and the French and the Germans, particularly over Morocco and the Middle East. And we can't really neglect the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire actually lost over 10% of their population to this war. It's ugly. But what this all shows is there's a lot of answers. Which one is the right one? It's not really settled at this point, which is why if you're looking for somewhere to do scholarship, this is much more interesting than the start of World War II, at least in terms of America. Why did America get involved in World War II? Well, we were bombed. Why did World War I start? Well, pick one of 5 or 6 causes and rank them. And because there's debate, that means there's stuff for us to do. The second thing that you need to have in your claim to really enter a debate is that your claim has to have a chance of being plausible. Now, this is an interesting one, because I can come up with a claim that sounds like it might work, but the plausibility is always the question. I know why the world's so messed up. It's because our president is a space alien. Yeah. Now, here's the thing. It wouldn't have mattered if Trump would have lost the election because, you know, Hillary Clinton? Also a space alien. Obviously, this is a patently ridiculous argument to make because the possibility of these two actually being space aliens is really small. Incidentally, I was really looking for a picture of Joe Biden as a space alien, but I could not find one. I was kind of hurt with that. But the people who Photoshop stuff really stepped up their game on Donald Trump on this one. Now, here's the thing. This is a ludicrous argument, but if I drove down to Washington, D.C., somehow snuck into the White House, and when Trump was in the middle of a speech, ripped off his mask, and you saw this on national TV, all of a sudden my argument's not so silly, is it? When we get new knowledge and new information in, the state of the art changes. When we learn new things, we have to reevaluate what's plausible and what's not plausible. This ties into the fact that the world is always changing. Some areas change a lot faster than others. What's plausible in the world of computers now wasn't plausible in the world of computers even 5 years ago. What's plausible 10 years from now is going to look like pretty much an impossibility to us now. As the state of knowledge grows, we have to reevaluate what we think is plausible, which is why research and learning are things you're really never going to get away from. The third factor on whether your argument is a position in a debate is it has to be shareable. People other than you have to be able to adopt this attitude successfully. For instance, I can tell you that 98% of the time when I'm talking to students, my mind is really thinking about cats. Could you possibly tell me I'm not? Maybe I'm doing a really good job hiding it. But I'm the only one who can know this. I could tell you that when it comes to songwriting, one of my biggest influences and the person I look up to the most is Amy Mann. But are you going to be able to prove me wrong? You might have a harder time finding Amy Mann's influence in my music than I do, but you can't really successfully argue that she's not an important influence to me. I can make an argument that I don't really have the mind of a human, instead I have the mind of a centaur, but you have no way of knowing that unless you dissect my mind and compare and contrast it to one of a centaur. Yeah, I know. When you have all these things, you can think about positioning yourself in a debate. If you have an argument that is not shareable, there are no reasonable differences, or it's not plausible, then you don't have an argument. If you do have an argument that fits those things, you can worry about trying to fit it into an area of debate. In the world of World War I scholars, there's a bunch of positions and there's a bunch of academics who have thoughts on this. You should be looking for your own little circle within this field, which means you're going to have to situate yourself in relationship to the people who are already thinking about this field. My belief is somewhere between the guy in the really cool scarf and the guy over on the left-hand side who's wearing a red jacket and sunglasses. I think sunglasses is cool on some stuff, but I think he's forgetting one thing that Mr. Scarf over there knows. So I put myself somewhere in the region. If I'm saying the exact same thing as, say, the woman just up from center who's wearing glasses and a blue hat, then I'm not really staking a position in the field. I'm repeating her position. If you're entering a debate, you really kind of need to come up with something that not a lot of other people are saying. Ideally, you want to be able to come up with a new position in the debate. And if you're able to do that, well, new ideas in the debate, that's one of the signs you're really entering the debate and trying to push it forward. And that is definitely something we want to do. Now, once you have an argument like that, there are certain expectations of you. The reader is going to expect, for instance, a clear statement of the writer's position, because we are not writing murder mysteries here. Nobody wants to get into your paper to find out, to have to work to find what your argument is. You should be making it clear. If you don't make it clear, the reader is going to assume you don't have an argument, so you've got to really be clear about it. The readers are going to expect that you're not just going to shove an argument and then call it a day. You have to have supporting evidence. It's the difference between argument and just making a wild claim or stating an opinion, is we have to bring evidence to support it. And it's not enough to just throw the evidence out there and hope that everyone sees it the same way we do. You have to explain how that evidence supports the claim. There are other things you can do to really highlight your position within that debate. Counter-arguments are one of them. No, not this kind of counter-arguments. This kind of counter-arguments. Joe thinks that this, but this is why he's wrong. What this is doing is adding a section to your argument where you are directly interacting with the other people in a debate. I mean, after all, the best way to show that you're participating in a debate is to actually participate in a debate. If you're having problems, or if your focus is getting too broad, a good thing to do is to add qualifiers to your argument. And what I mean by qualifiers is something that narrows the scope of what you're doing. Look, it's almost never the problem that somebody's scope is too narrow. The problem is almost always someone's scope is too bold. So let me show you what we're talking about. If we want to make an argument over who is the best president or who is the worst president, we could do that. I could say that the absolute worst president was Gerald Ford. University of Michigan football player, actually. Anyway, if I just made that argument, though, it's not really going to be all that doable, because I would have to compare Gerald Ford to every other president on every single metric. You couldn't even do that in a book. That would be a series of books. So I would have to come up with a specific angle. I could say, for instance, that one of the reasons why Ford was the worst president is that he could have brought justice to the country, but instead pardoned Richard Nixon. I could say that one of the reasons he was the worst president was that he did fall down every so often. I don't know if those are the best comparisons. I would say a more apt argument would be he was the worst president in terms of the economy. Now, we're still having to compare him to every other president, but we're a bit more focused. The economy is only one part of what the job of president gets judged by. However, the economy is also a massively complex thing, so we'd have to qualify it a bit further. He was the absolute worst president in terms of the economy because of the way he structured tax brackets. Gets to a more specific thing. And it would be a much more specific argument still if, instead of comparing him to every single other president, I compared him to one or two others, or to the last 5. It makes my argument more doable. It makes the claims I make more precise. It makes my position within the debate that much clearer. Ultimately, what you want to end up doing is get in there into the meat of the argument, claim your own little area, act like a professional, and fight off all oncomers. It's not really that violent, but when you get into positioning yourself within a debate, you're starting to enter into a field of knowledge. And that's a bit more important of a thing than just sitting there and saying, this is what I think. Nah, claim that ground and make it your own. See you next video.